All right, so just thinking quite a narrow subject in a sense, but we're going to go fairly broad into different areas, but we're thinking about effective contemporary communication. And what I'd like to do in this, I'm coming from a perspective of preaching and kind of from the front type of communication. And so I will default to talking about that. But some of what I say in regard to preaching would apply to other things as well. What I'm not going to do is try to talk about preaching or communicating in a sort of formal sense and conversations and apologetic presentations and debates and everything else. I'm just going to kind of focus it on preaching, but feel free to translate it into whatever kind of ministry realm you want to think about. And my goal here is not to give a definitive and nuanced presentation on every aspect of any ministry, not even just preaching. I'm simply talking about what makes communication effective, or what helps our communication to be effective in the world that we're now living in. So we're going to touch on online, kind of communicating online, because that's become a thing for the past 15 months. We're not going to just talk about that, because I hope it's not going to be the thing for the rest of our ministries. Going to talk about some broader trends in society and also some narrow communications specific issues. But hopefully this will be helpful. I'll move through the notes, and then we should have some time for clarification and Q&A and interaction at the end. Obviously, we're quite a good sized group, so we won't have time for kind of 10-minute back and forth questions, but we should have some time for some clarification at the end. So let me just kind of move through the material that we have. What I'm going to put on the screen is what is in the notes that you get through the app. So don't feel like you need to scribble down everything that you see on the screen, because you've already got it. But obviously feel free to make notes or eat chocolate or whatever you find most helpful during these kind of sessions. So first of all, then, there's basically four shifts that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the concentration shift. Has there been a shift in our ability to concentrate? And this applies to all sorts of different things. But if you imagine these two questions, what was the maximum concentration span in the 1950s? And what is the maximum concentration span in the 2020s? That's 70 years apart. That's a couple of generations, quite a significant amount of change in the world over these past years. Just give that thought for a moment. I'm not going to ask you to answer, and I don't actually have definitive scientific evidence here, but I think what I'm going to share with you is actually fairly accurate. But what do you think? Kind of how many minutes could people concentrate for 70 years ago, and how many minutes can people concentrate for now? Is it more? Is it less? Is it radically different? Just give that a thought for a second, and then I'll tell you what I think, and you can either disagree with me or give yourself a prize if we've got similar answers. I don't think we give ourselves enough prizes in the Christian world. We need more affirmation, more chocolate, or more books. That's the best prize. Buy yourself a book. But what do you think about concentration span in minutes? What most people think is that in the past, people could concentrate for 30, 40, 50 minutes. And today, people maybe can concentrate for 10, 15, at the most 20 minutes. That tends to be the answer that people would give to this kind of question. So in the past, 2 or 3 times longer. I would say, with some support, I would suggest that in the 1950s, the concentration span maximum was probably 3 to 5 minutes. And now in the 2020s, the concentration span maximum is about 3 to 5 minutes. And that is to say, humans are not incredible concentration machines, and they never have been. Now, that's not to say that you can only communicate with people for 3 to 5 minutes, but it does say that you cannot bore them and expect to hold their attention for long periods of time. My mentor and teacher, when I studied preaching in kind of the last degree that I did, was Haddon Robinson, who was a phenomenal communicator and also a phenomenal thinker about communication. And he says the reason that he got into studying preaching in the first place was simple. He said, I listened to some people and they could make 10 minutes feel like an hour. And other people could make an hour feel like 10 minutes. And I wanted to know what the difference was. And maybe you've experienced that. Some people are long and boring before they've even started practically, and other people can keep going. And you're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize the time had gone. That was so engaging. And the reality is that a good communicator is going to continually draw people in. And so if somebody is able to do that through a combination of their content, their delivery, their interpersonal connection, then they are able to keep an audience listening easily for 40 minutes or an hour or longer. Other people can't get anywhere near that, even when they're at their best, because they just don't grab attention in the same way. Now, the moment we say grab attention, it sounds like fireworks and excitement, but actually you can find that a variety of styles will draw people in. And so there are some people that are very big and very energetic and loud and lots of gesture, and they can be really gripping to listen to, but also people who are very quiet and very thoughtful and, you know, almost just kind of speak like this. They can also draw people in. So it's not a style thing. It's somehow a combination of content, maybe style of delivery, but it's really the connection repeatedly happening. And so if you're preparing a message, for example, and you know there's a block of content that's going to take 15 minutes to work through, you should tell yourself, I can't keep people purely by this block of content. I need to bring them back as I go. Maybe a little bit of humor, maybe some sort of statement of, you know, reference to relevance in some way. Maybe there's something. What can I do? Do I change pace? What can I do? Because 15 minutes of straight information is too much. Okay, so 15 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, that's not our concern. It's every 3 to 5 minutes, people are going to start drifting. How can we bring them back? It's not true that this generation is unable to concentrate. We hear that a lot. The reality is the human brain is shifting. People are much more on their phones. They're much more kind of bombarded by different information. They're less used to sitting and listening to straight content. But at the same time, the younger generation will go to conferences and sit for an hour while Tim Keller preaches, or an hour while John Piper preaches, or whoever. They're, you know, good communicators can hold the younger generation's attention. And so it's not as simple as, well, this generation just can't do it. They can. And you'll notice as well with those two examples, Keller and Piper don't intersperse videos and fireworks every 3 minutes in their preaching, right? It's not gimmicks. It's not visual demonstration. It's not video graphics and CGI. It's that quality of content and delivery that will engage people. Now, somebody that's dull and boring doesn't get invited these days as much as maybe they did in the past. But the reality is, in the past, people may have sat politely, but they weren't really listening. Right? Humans have got an amazing ability to be somewhere else. You know, you can be sat in church, looking at the preacher, nodding, and thinking about golf or football or food, you know, or your job interview or whatever. And so yeah, we need to get away from this simplistic idea that the current generation just can't concentrate anymore. They never could, as much as we give people credit for. Long sermons are not impossible for the younger generation if they're well preached. Long movies are getting longer. 30 years ago, movies were 80 or 90 minutes. That was it. Nowadays, 2 hours, 3 hours for a movie, much more common. So length of concentration maybe is not the thing we need to focus on, but we can certainly come back to it if you want to. Let's think about the second element here. And this is where I think there has been a shift culturally, and it may be slightly different in different cultures, but I suspect there may be some consistency to what I'm going to say between cultures. There's been a shift from performance to authenticity. Let me explain what I mean. In the past, public speaking, whether it was preaching or just, secular public speaking, was about vocal coaching, training you to have a voice that can communicate in a large auditorium with no amplification. And so there would be coaching. So my dad, for example, studied at Bible school in the 1960s. He was trained by people who learned probably in the 1920s and 30s. They weren't used to headset microphones and a sound desk at the back. And so they had large venues that echoed, that were difficult to communicate in. They had to learn how to breathe. They had to learn how to pronounce things. They learned how to have a voice that would preach and be able to hear what they were saying. That was an important thing back in the 1930s. Now, my dad's generation could now be teaching my generation, and it's only gone through one generation of teachers, but it's gone 4 generations of humans. And to me, it would be a waste of time to emphasize vocal coaching today. Not completely, but somewhat, because a lot of the things that you need to communicate in a room, of 1,000 people with bad acoustics is irrelevant to most of us for most of our life. Because in most settings, we've got a microphone here or here. We've got a person at the back adjusting how we're communicating. And if we shout or if we whisper, people can still hear it, and they can hear it as if they were stood a few meters away from us. And so we don't have to speak differently. And because of that, I think you can be sat in a large, think about ELF. You can be sat anywhere in that large hall. Unless you're in certain places, you may not even be watching the preacher. You're probably watching the big screen. And when you're watching the big screen, he seems closer, right? And so because he's closer, you're looking at him as a person communicating to you, not a person communicating to 800. And so there's a shift in that in terms of how we communicate, because when you're close up to somebody and they look like they're communicating to a crowd, it does feel a little bit strange. Big gestures and grand voices and rolling your tongue in order to enunciate your words. These kind of things that maybe made sense in a big venue, they don't work even in a screen that is a big venue in the same way. There's a shift. And so there's a sense of we're closer to the people who are communicating, and we value not, oh, wow, what a voice. I don't hear people say that anymore. I remember my dad's generation saying that. Oh, what a wonderful voice the preacher had tonight. And I was like, well, who cares? Why are we talking about his voice? In his generation, that mattered. But to me, that same person, I could be thinking, he's kind of weird. Right? He spoke in this weird way. It was strange. I think the younger generation, and I'm going to very generously include myself in the younger generation, but the younger generation today is not so impressed with performance. They're more drawn to authentic. Now, authentic may be in quotes, and I'll give you some examples of that in a second, but there's this sense of, I want that person who is speaking to me to be the same person if I chat to them in the corridor. Okay, that's very different. In the old days, I want them to have a great voice when they're in front of us. Now, people want them to be real. And so think about how communicators in our culture have shifted. For example, TV presenters. If I go back a generation, there was a strong emphasis on a certain way of speaking. And so in my country, a lot of the TV presenters came from one accent. And anybody else was kind of strange and different and, kind of edgy and rebellious because they had a different accent. Today, that's crazy. No one thinks in those terms. I remember my dad complaining about a TV presenter who had a different accent. I don't know why that accent is on television. Like now I think, oh, you can't say that. That it doesn't matter as long as you can understand them. That's not the issue. But there's been a shift from a sort of performance, perfect English in the past to real. Different accents, different people. Think about radio. In the past, it was very much a read script. The person presenting would have the perfect accent and would tell the information. Today, I can't find a radio station apart from music, but where there's a radio station with people talking, it's always two, at least. There's always back and forth. There's energy. There's jokes and comments and laughter. It's much more energetic, much more normal, the way you would hear people talking in real life, rather than a performance of somebody who is perfectly explaining the news. There's a shift that's taken place in radio. Think about comedy. When I think back to comedy in my childhood, it's quite distressing to think about what people used to find funny. Now, I understand because it used to be funny, but a lot of the comedians were just weird. If we were all from one culture, if we were all, from my culture, I could give examples. But it was people had little things that they did, their sort of signature joke, or they would wear something funny, or they would have an animal that was their hand that would attack people. And we used to think that was the funniest thing on earth. Now, comedians don't have quite that same weirdness. If you listen to a lot of comedians now, they seem like a fairly normal person-ish, slightly strange, but they tell stories, they communicate about real life, they talk about something as if they were there, maybe they exaggerate it, but they're much more human rather than comical, if that makes sense. There's this shift, I think, culturally. When we sense that somebody is performing, we go, oh, I don't like that. Maybe, for example, if you make a phone call to a company, the moment you sense the person is reading a script, you don't like it anymore. Can I speak to your manager? You're not talking to me. There's a lack of interest. If you're trying to buy a car, the moment you feel like the salesperson is just repeating what they always say, nowadays most people just they kind of have this feeling inside of, oh, I want to interact with a human. I don't want to interact with somebody. My grandmother would listen to a salesman and at the end of it say, well, that was very impressive, because she was impressed with his performance of his sales presentation. You see, there's a shift over the generations. And I think what that shift is saying to us as a church is, if we come to preach on a Sunday or communicate on the street or whatever situation, if people get the sense that we're just putting on an act, doing a thing that we do, they will kind of switch off. But if they sense that the way we're communicating is probably the way we would communicate in person, if they were to have a conversation with us, we would be kind of the same. I think that's actually what people are looking for, which has a huge advantage. We don't have to pretend we're something we're not. We can be ourselves. Now, I would still say there are things you can do to communicate better naturally, and it takes some work to sound natural when you're preaching or speaking to a big crowd. or any crowd. But the blessing in this, the encouragement in this, is you don't have to be Billy Graham or John Piper or Pete Williams. You get to be you. And if you're big and loud and energetic and lots of gestures, your hands have been trained in Italy, great. Use your Italian hands to communicate. If you're very still and gentle and quiet, people don't mind that. There's a place for different styles of communication, but people will sniff out when you are pretending to be somebody else. And so we don't need to do that. It's not helpful to do that. I suppose the goal would be to be the best you that you can be, be the most natural you. There's some things that you have to adjust when you're speaking to a crowd. You have to gesture backwards in order for it to look natural to them. There's certain things about communicating with a crowd, but the goal is to be natural, not to be a performer. And I think that's culturally true, and it's consistent with what we're trying to do. We want to be real. Now, the ironic thing, just as a comment here, is that many of our cultures have fallen in love with a concept that is the most unnatural thing in the world, called reality TV, right? Where you put a token group of people deliberately chosen into a venue to do something very weird and be watched by the cameras while they show how dysfunctional and how broken they are as humans. And everybody seems to love it, apart from probably us. That doesn't change what I'm saying. It's just a bad version of the same thing. Instead of watching a drama being acted, people are watching fake, poor actors acting out in a way that's supposed to be real. And so it's almost like a caricature. It's a fake version, but it shows the value that I'm talking about, that people want something authentic. The reality is, you put 10 people together from society, they're not going to be 7 of them who are homosexual, and all these kind of things that happen on reality TV. That's not normal. That's deliberately driven. But the goal is what we're talking about, for people to watch and go, oh, they're real people. That's kind of what we're offering. So there's that whole shift from performance to authenticity, whether it's genuinely authentic or not. That's a factor in effective communication. Let me move on to the next one. And this is kind of broader and wider. We're living in a massively shifting world. And we need to be aware of these things, because being aware of them will help us to communicate effectively. Things that were very on target even 10 years ago just are not the reality today. So we've had this shift going on from objective truth to subjective realities for probably 40, 50 years. We're familiar with that. It's getting stronger, obviously. How do we communicate in a world where people don't believe there is objective reality, or objective truth? It's a challenge. We can't assume that they think that reality exists. Increasingly, people think it's my truth, your truth. I'm not sure I accept your truth. All that kind of subjective evaluation. They don't do the logic of thinking, well, some things are just true. Increasingly, people seem convinced that they choose what's true, which is bizarre, because nobody has yet chosen that gravity is not true and successfully flown. Do you know what I mean? Like, gravity affects everybody, whether you believe in it or not. And so it seems to me fairly obvious that there must be some things that are true and therefore some things that are not true. But we increasingly have people who genuinely seem to think, well, I don't accept that, therefore it's not true. And so that's something for us to wrestle with as Christians, that we don't fall into the trap of presenting Christianity as an option, and then when people accept it, it becomes true. The reality is, it's true. Jesus did rise from the dead. If somebody doesn't accept that, he still rose from the dead. But we need to remind ourselves of that and think, okay, how do we communicate in a world where that really is shifting. Another little thing to mention, this is a huge thing. We're now facing a shift in morality that is absolutely astonishing when you get into it. For centuries, we've had a Judeo-Christian morality in most of our cultures, sort of a 10 commandments type of understanding of reality, that murder is wrong, stealing is wrong. Now we're in a situation where those basics are not true anymore for people. Now there is oppressed people who are right because of their identity, and there are the oppressors who are wrong because of their identity, and all of us are in some way oppressors. For one thing, we believe in a white religion. So Christians and Jews don't get the privilege that other religions get of being an oppressed religion, because we are white religion, which is totally stupid, but that's the way our world is thinking. Okay, many of us are male, oppressor. Many of us are white, oppressor. And so, heterosexual, oppressor. There's a new morality, and we've got to understand that in order to communicate with people. Because if we bring the old way of thinking and just say, forget it, I know that we're all equally sinful, equally redeemable, whatever, truth is truth, I'm just going to say it, we may find ourselves completely missing people who have a whole different set of views and values. Okay, so that's a massive subject, much bigger than we can talk about in this session, but I want to just bring it in because you can have all the techniques of effective communication, but if your content is fundamentally upside down from everybody's perspective, no matter how cool you sound, you're not sounding relevant. And so this one's huge. We're living in a world, literally in the last 10 years, it's emerged a sort of militant postmodernism that is now trying to take over, or is succeeding in taking over society. Somehow we've got to figure out how to communicate with that. And this one people are aware of, but it's worth mentioning. In the past, there was a biblical awareness in some cultures. Now there's very few cultures where there's any real biblical awareness. Biblical illiteracy is massive. People are as oblivious to the Bible as they are to ancient Hindu writings. That's shifting some aspects of our speaking and teaching. Let me just move through the last slide, and then I'll come back, and I see some chat in the chat box, but rather than engage things, if it's okay, I'll just keep going. Okay, so we've thought about the fact there isn't really a shift in concentration span. That's a common thought. I want to dismiss that. There is a shift in communication style that's taken place in our culture, from performance to authenticity. I think we should embrace that, and we should lean into that. There are some much bigger shifts going on, such as these, that affect content, especially in terms of how we engage our world. The truth of the Bible has not changed, by the way, but how that truth is communicated needs to shift. And then fourthly, we have sometimes, like when there's a random pandemic, sometimes we are shifted to communicating online. And because of the current circumstances, I thought it'd be worth dropping in a few thoughts about this, because most of us probably have already communicated, certainly on a Zoom call, but communicating a Sunday sermon to a church through a camera, it's just a very different thing than we're used to. And so here's 7 quick tips, if you like. I'll just mention these briefly. Don't be intimidated by higher tech churches. All right, my church functioned through this for several months. It took us probably 6-7 months before we bought a camera other than my phone. But with my phone, we were communicating during the lockdown. Okay, now you'll see people. I saw people last year within 2 weeks showing their new church studio. They had computers and sound desks and dedicated lighting and cameras. And I suppose it was kind of cool to go, oh, look at how Christians are adapting. But it was really intimidating for small churches that could not afford to spend 3,000 euros on equipment, or didn't have people with the skill to make that incredible editing happen. Yeah, that's life. Don't be intimidated by churches that can do things you can't do. You're still the person responsible, if you're the pastor, to communicate to your church. And if the best you can do is through your phone, use your phone. Spend 30 euros on a tripod so that you're not holding your phone, and praise the Lord. It doesn't have to be thousands of dollars. Eye contact is different. Okay, when you're used to preaching to a crowd or communicating with a group, even in a Bible study, you're used to looking around, to make eye contact with people. If you do that with a camera on you, you look weird, right? And so I saw a lot of people in their church preaching as if there was a congregation in the room and a camera was on them, and it just looked really strange. I think we've had to learn to make eye contact. Even Zoom is distracting because I'm tempted to look down at the few faces I can see, but really I should be looking at that lens. And so learning to make eye contact, and really I'm making eye contact in a way that feels so unnatural to me, but for the listener, oh, he's looking at me. There's a connection. We're designed for that. Okay, so eye contact is a different dynamic. Preach to your church with possible guests. Don't get carried away. So if you're used to preaching to 30 people in your church and they're mostly old people, preach as if there's like 30 old people. Don't think, oh, this is online. There could be millions watching. Firstly, there aren't millions watching because there's other stuff online that's higher tech, so no offense, but they're going to go to kind of listen to somebody like Piper or Keller given the chance. You may get a few guests, praise the Lord, but don't preach kind of as if you've got this amazing audience. Preach as if you're preaching to the people you know. If it's a group of students, communicate with a group of students. Be sensitive to the fact there may be others listening. We'll think about that as well. But don't forget your people because of the vague possibility that there are untold millions suddenly tuning into your church presentation. Okay, so be aware of possible guests, assume it's a few. So do be personal, be real, use personal content, but remember that what you're putting out there is out there for everybody to see, whether you want them to see it or not. So we need to be really careful. We can't just drop little comments in about the church down the road or about another denomination or about a famous speaker and expect them not to know about it. You probably shouldn't do that anyway, but definitely don't do that to a camera. Expect to feel drained. If you're the kind of person that leads a Bible study or preaches to a church or speaks at a conference and you kind of get energy from it, you enjoy it, you enjoy the buzz, you enjoy the connections, you enjoy the fellowship. If you're that kind of person, some of us are, some of us aren't, just expect that when you spend your time in a room with lights and a little glass lens, but no humans, at the end of it, you're just tired. You've had to generate energy with no feedback. We're designed to have that feedback, even if it's a room of people. We're designed for that connection. Speaking to a camera is just tiring in a different way. No travel, no, long conversations and stuff that may be draining in normal life, but it's just, I've felt that feeling a lot more in the last year on camera than I have in person for years. So just expect that. Think through the impact of zero feedback during your presentation. No eye contact. If you're speaking on Zoom like this, maybe you'll get some smiles and some nods. That's great if you happen to have the right people on the screen. But when you're speaking to just a camera with no faces, there's nothing. There's no feedback at all. No one falling asleep, no one smiling and nodding, no kind of little giggles in the congregation. you know, no energy, no distractions. It's just you and your mind and the camera, and it's weird. And so having zero feedback means that you can't take note of people being distracted and, you know, draw them back in. You can't take your energy from people that are nodding and smiling and telling you facially they love you. None of that. You're on your own, and you have to self-generate the energy to speak enthusiastically rather than just ending up going through your content and becoming a little bit dull because there's no one really there anyway, is there? You know, that's so easy to do. And then number 7, I've not said this yet, but I could have said this at every point in the process: pray about it. The big issue with speaking online, and the big issue with speaking in a shifting culture, and the big issue of speaking in a changing communications world, ultimately the big issue is still you need God to work. That's true in everything that I've said. And so pray about it. Don't spend all your time focusing on making sure that you've got your Wi-Fi and you've got your backup connection and your tripod is set. All of that stuff is important, but pray that it works, and pray that what you say helps. Pray that God works through your speaking, because you could have the best technology in the world and it could all work perfectly, and you could have the best content delivered amazingly, but unless God shows up, apart from him, we can do nothing. And so we want to be praying and trusting him in all of these things, whatever the changes are. We could have talked, I could have added something on here about speaking live to people wearing masks. Never would have thought that was a thing 2 years ago, but it's very different. It changes the dynamic, and hopefully my not mentioning it means that it can go away and we don't have to talk about it ever again. But maybe for some people, that might be a permanent thing. Some people love their masks. So lots of different things to consider.